Welcome back to Void of Fears. Before we jump into today's story, I've got to ask for a quick favour. If you could smash that like button, drop a comment below, and hit subscribe if you haven't already. It seriously makes a huge difference. YouTube's algorithm loves that stuff, and it pushes my videos to new viewers who might dig these stories too. I really appreciate every single one of you who takes the time to do that. It means the world to me and helps keep this channel growing. Alright, enough of me rambling. Let's dive into today's story. The wind howled across the Atacama desert like the death rattle of a dying god, carrying with it the whispers of 1 billion extinguished stars. Dr. Vincent Hayes stood in the control room of the radio telescope array, his reflection ghosted in the monitors that surrounded him like accusatory eyes. The digital clock on the wall read 3:47 AM, its red numerals pulsing in rhythm with something he couldn't quite identify. A beat that seemed to emanate not from the clock itself, but from somewhere much deeper, much more ancient. The coffee in his ceramic mug had gone cold hours ago, forming a thin skin across the surface that reminded him uncomfortably of dead flesh. At 42, Vincent had spent nearly 2 decades listening to the cosmos, cataloguing the death songs of distant galaxies and the birth cries of newborn stars. His colleagues often joked that he could hear the universe breathing, but tonight, as he stared at the cascade of data flowing across his screens like digital blood, Vincent wasn't laughing. The universe wasn't just breathing tonight, it was trying to speak. The signal pulsed across the monitors in rhythmic waves, emanating from a super-Earth designated Gliese 832 CX, 16 light-years away in the constellation Gliese. The star system had been discovered only months before, a red dwarf surrounded by 3 planets, one of which fell squarely within the habitable zone. Standard procedure had dictated a routine scan for radio emissions, the kind of background listening that had become as automatic as breathing for astronomers around the world. But what made Vincent's hands tremble against the keyboard wasn't the fact that they'd discovered an artificial transmission from deep space. He'd been expecting that for years, had dreamed of it during countless sleepless nights, had built his entire career around the possibility of first contact. Every SETI researcher secretly hoped to be the one to catch that first whisper from another world. No, what made his blood run cold was the rhythm itself. It was organic, hypnotic, alive in a way that purely artificial signals never were, like a massive heart beating in the darkness between stars, each pulse carrying with it a weight that seemed to press against his chest from the inside. The signal wasn't just structured, it was breathing, and with each breath, it was calling to something deep within him that he'd never known existed. Vincent pressed his palm against his chest, feeling his own heartbeat. For a terrifying moment, he couldn't tell where his pulse ended and the signal began. They seemed to be synchronizing, his human rhythm gradually aligning itself with the cosmic pulse that crossed 16 light-years of empty space to find him here, alone in the Chilean desert at nearly 4 in the morning. "Dr. Hayes, you need to see this right now," called out Dr. Rachel Torres from her workstation across the room. Her voice carried an odd tremor that Vincent had never heard before in all their years of working together. Rachel was unflappable, the kind of woman who could maintain her composure during equipment failures, funding cuts, and the endless bureaucracy of government science. She had once talked a panicking graduate student through a near-catastrophic telescope malfunction, while simultaneously rewriting code and drinking her morning coffee, but now her voice shook like autumn leaves in a hurricane. Vincent pushed back from his desk, his chair squealing against the linoleum floor, with a sound like fingernails on slate. As he walked across the control room, he noticed that the other night shift workers had all stopped what they were doing. Dr. Morrison from the Gamma Ray Burst team stood motionless at his station, staring at a screen full of cosmic ray data. Janet Kim from communications had her hands frozen over her keyboard. her eyes fixed on something invisible in the middle distance. Even Carlos, the night janitor, had stopped mopping and was standing perfectly still in the doorway, his weathered face turned toward the ceiling, as if he were listening to music only he could hear. They all looked like people trying to remember something important that had been lost long ago. Rachel's workstation was a chaos of open windows and scrolling code, her monitors displaying wavelength analyses and frequency breakdowns that painted abstract patterns across the screens. Her fingers flew across the keyboard with desperate urgency, her eyes wide and unblinking, pupils dilated as if she were in shock. She'd been working on isolating the signal's carrier wave, trying to extract any embedded information that might be hidden within the transmission's complex structure. "Rachel, what is it?" Vincent asked, but she didn't seem to hear him. She was staring at her main monitor with an expression of recognition that made no sense. It was the look of someone seeing a childhood home after decades of absence, that mixture of joy and sorrow that comes with recovering something precious that you'd thought was lost forever. The signal had begun transmitting visual information, slowly, impossibly. A three-dimensional holographic projection was forming in the air above Rachel's workstation. It flickered and wavered like a mirage in desert heat, but gradually solidified into something that made Vincent's knees weak and his vision blur at the edges. It was Earth, but not the Earth they knew, not the blue marble that had been photographed a million times from space, with its familiar continents and pristine oceans swirled with white clouds. This was something else entirely, something that existed in the spaces between memory and nightmare, between what was and what could never be. The planet rotated slowly in the holographic display, and Vincent could see the continents he knew: North America, Europe, Asia, Africa, but they were wrong in ways that made his brain itch. Ancient pyramids towered over New York City, their surfaces covered in hieroglyphs that seemed to move and shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. The Amazon rainforest was gone, replaced by vast cities of black stone that spiraled up toward a sky the color of dried blood. The Sahara Desert bloomed with impossible gardens, where crystalline trees grew in perfect geometric patterns, their branches forming fractal spirals that hurt to contemplate for too long. "That's not possible," Vincent whispered, but even as he spoke, he felt a strange familiarity wash over him like warm bathwater. Somewhere deep in his mind, buried beneath decades of rational thought and scientific skepticism, he could almost remember standing beneath that crimson sky, walking through those impossible cities, breathing air that tasted of copper and ancient starlight and something else, something that might have been home. The hologram continued to rotate, revealing more impossible details with each revolution. The Great Wall of China extended not just across the country, but around the entire globe, a serpentine barrier that pulsed with internal light like a vast circulatory system. The Mediterranean Sea had been replaced by a crater filled with what looked like liquid starlight, its surface rippling with patterns that resembled neural networks. And at the poles, instead of ice caps, there were massive structures that defied description, their geometries folding in on themselves in ways that made Vincent's vision blur and his stomach churn. The structures at the poles were the worst part. They seemed to exist in more dimensions than his eyes could process, casting shadows that fell upward and reflecting light that came from sources that weren't there. Looking at them was like trying to perceive a tesseract with human vision, an exercise in futility that left him feeling dizzy and disoriented. "I've been having dreams about this place," Rachel said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every night since we first detected the signal, I dream that I'm walking through those cities and everyone I meet tells me I'm finally home." Vincent felt his heart skip a beat, then resume its rhythm in perfect synchronization with the cosmic pulse. "What do you mean, everyone you meet?" "People from my past, my grandmother who died when I was 7, my college roommate who was killed in a car accident 10 years ago, My father. Her voice cracked on the last word, and Vincent saw tears streaming down her face. They're all there, Vincent. They're all waiting for me. They tell me they've been waiting such a long time. A chill ran down Vincent's spine like ice water in his veins. He'd been having strange dreams too, but he'd dismissed them as stress-induced nightmares brought on by too much coffee and too little sleep. The dreams of walking across endless red landscapes towards structures that seemed to exist outside of normal space-time. But now, looking at the impossible Earth rotating in the holographic display, he realized that his dreams hadn't been random at all. Every night since the signal had started, Vincent had found himself walking across a rust-colored plain toward a massive dark structure that seemed to swallow light itself. The building was enormous, easily the size of a mountain, and its surface was covered in symbols that he almost recognized but couldn't quite read. They reminded him of cuneiform, but also of mathematical equations, and sometimes of sheet music for instruments that had never been invented. As he walked, voices called to him from the shadows cast by the impossible architecture, speaking in languages that felt familiar despite being utterly alien. The words themselves meant nothing to him, but their emotional content was unmistakable. Love, longing, welcome, and an overwhelming sense of homecoming. "Vincent, come home," the voices whispered with the collective harmony of a choir made from starlight. "You never left. You were just dreaming of being away." He'd wake gasping, his sheets soaked with sweat that smelled faintly of ozone and distant rain. But the dream never faded like normal dreams do. It lingered throughout the day, crystal clear, as if it were a memory rather than a product of his sleeping mind. And each night he got a little closer to the dark structure, and the voices grew a little clearer, a little more insistent. Over the next few days, the signal continued its transmission with the patience of geological time. The holographic Earth grew more detailed, more vivid, showing cities and structures that seemed to blend architectural styles from across human history with technologies that wouldn't exist for centuries, if ever. Egyptian obelisks stood beside Roman amphitheatres, which gave way to Gothic cathedrals that morphed seamlessly into modernist skyscrapers that wouldn't be built for another 50 years. But scattered throughout were buildings and machines that belonged to no earthly civilization. Structures that seemed to bend space around themselves, creating impossible interiors that were larger than their exteriors. Vehicles that moved through the air without any visible means of propulsion, their forms flowing like living creatures. And everywhere the symbols that Vincent had been seeing in his dreams, carved into every surface, written across the impossible sky in letters of fire. It was as if someone had taken all of human civilization, past and future, and compressed it into a single, impossible timeline. And the more Vincent studied the transmission, the more he realized that the someone doing the compressing knew things about humanity that humanity didn't know about itself. The signal wasn't just showing them Earth, it was showing them home. But the strangest part wasn't the holographic display itself. It was what happened to everyone who worked on decoding it. Dr. Kim from the engineering department started speaking Korean in his sleep, even though he'd been born in Ohio and barely knew a dozen words in his parents' native language. When his wife recorded him one night, the linguistics department at the local university couldn't identify the dialect. It was Korean, but Korean as it had been spoken centuries ago, with grammatical structures that had been lost to time. Dr. Cross from the consulting biology team began drawing pictures of plants that didn't exist anywhere on Earth. The sketches were incredibly detailed, showing root systems and cellular structures that followed patterns found nowhere in terrestrial biology. When she showed them to botanists at the university, they were fascinated and disturbed in equal measure. The plants were alien, but they followed design principles that seemed to improve upon earthly evolution. Young Tommy Martinez from the IT department quit his job without explanation, leaving behind only a note that said he had to go home to a place he'd never been. His supervisor found him 3 days later, standing in the middle of the Mojave Desert, perfectly healthy but completely unable to explain how he'd gotten there, or why he'd felt compelled to make the journey. Vincent tried to dismiss these incidents as coincidence, stress reactions to the magnitude of their discovery. But deep down he knew better. The signal was doing something to them, changing them in ways that were both subtle and profound. And the most disturbing part was that the changes felt right, like puzzle pieces finally clicking into place after a lifetime of being scattered and lost. The dreams intensified with each passing night. Vincent found himself spending more time in that red landscape, walking toward the dark structure that dominated the horizon like a geometric mountain. The voices grew clearer, more distinct, and he began to recognize some of them. His mother, who had died of cancer when he was in graduate school. His mentor, Professor Williams, who had inspired him to pursue astronomy. His childhood dog, Max, who had been hit by a car when Vincent was 10 years old. They were all there, waiting for him in the shadow of that impossible building, and they all told him the same thing. He was finally coming home to a place he'd never left. "We've been waiting so long," his mother said, her voice exactly as he remembered it, warm and patient and full of unconditional love. "We knew you'd find your way back eventually." "The journey was necessary," Professor Williams added, adjusting the spectacles he'd worn in life. "You had to learn, had to grow, had to understand what you were returning to." Even Max was there, his golden retriever fur shining in the strange light of that alien sky, his tail wagging with the same enthusiastic joy Vincent remembered from childhood. The dog couldn't speak, of course, but his presence communicated something deeper than words. Pure, unconditional welcome. Within a week, NASA had mobilized every available resource. The implications were staggering, world-changing, species-defining. Not only had they discovered definitive proof of extraterrestrial intelligence, but that intelligence seemed to know about Earth in ways that defied explanation. The signal was being studied by teams around the world, and reports were coming in of similar phenomena everywhere. Radio telescope operators in Australia were having dreams about walking through underwater cities populated by beings who looked almost human, but moved with the fluid grace of sea creatures. Researchers in Germany were drawing pictures of flying machines that looked like crosses between birds and spacecraft, their designs incorporating principles of aerodynamics that wouldn't be discovered for decades. A team in Japan had collectively started building a scale model of the dark structure Vincent had been seeing in his dreams, working with an obsessive focus that alarmed their supervisors. The most disturbing report came from the Goldstone Deep Space Communications Complex in California. The entire night shift had been found standing in the parking lot at dawn, all facing in the same direction, all humming the same melody that no one could remember learning. When questioned, they all gave the same answer. They were listening for instructions from home. The decision was made to launch a probe to Gliese 832CX, using experimental propulsion technology that would get it there in just under 2 years. The probe would be equipped with every sensor and communication device humanity could muster, a mechanical ambassador to whatever was waiting for them in that distant star system. Vincent volunteered for the follow-up manned mission before the probe even left Earth's orbit. The dreams had become more than vivid now. They were invasive, consuming his waking thoughts and making it impossible to focus on anything else. He found himself drawing the same symbols he'd seen in his dreams, covering pages of his notebook with flowing script that looked almost like writing, but didn't correspond to any human language. When he showed the symbols to Dr. Torres, she went pale as moonlight. "I've been drawing these too," she said, pulling out her own notebook. The pages were covered with the same flowing script, written in the same hand despite being drawn by a different person. I have no idea what they mean, but I can't stop making them. It's like my hand knows something my brain doesn't. The symbols seemed to move when Vincent wasn't looking directly at them, shifting and changing like living things. And sometimes, in the corner of his vision, he could swear he saw them glowing with their own internal light, pulsing in rhythm with the cosmic heartbeat that had started everything. Dr. Torres wasn't the only one experiencing the phenomenon. Around the world, people who had been exposed to the signal were reporting similar experiences. They would find themselves writing in unknown languages, drawing pictures of places they'd never been, humming melodies that seemed to come from somewhere deep in their genetic memory. The symbols appeared everywhere, scratched into the margins of scientific papers, carved into park benches, spray-painted on the sides of buildings. They followed patterns that suggested meaning, but no linguist or cryptographer could crack the code. It was as if humanity was trying to remember a language it had forgotten long ago. The probe reached Gliese 832 CX on a Wednesday evening in late autumn, when the desert air was crisp and the stars seemed close enough to touch. Vincent was in the control room when the first transmissions came through, along with what felt like half of NASA's senior staff and representatives from space agencies around the world. The moment felt historic, the kind of event that would be remembered for as long as humans told stories. The initial readings were exactly what they'd hoped for. Breathable atmosphere, liquid water, Earth-like gravity, and a surface that appeared to be covered in lush vegetation. The planet was not just habitable, it was actively welcoming, as if it had been prepared specifically for human visitors. For weeks the probe transmitted regular updates that painted a picture of an impossible paradise. The climate was stable, with no extreme weather patterns or seasonal variations. The atmospheric composition was perfect for human respiration, with exactly the right mixture of oxygen and nitrogen. The surface showed signs of what looked like advanced terraforming, with features that were too organized and geometric to be natural. The continents were arranged in patterns that followed mathematical principles, their coastlines forming equations written in stone and water. Mountain ranges stretched across the landscape in perfect spirals that resembled the golden ratio made manifest in geology. Oceans moved in currents that formed fractals when viewed from orbit, their waters so clear that the probe's cameras could see to the bottom, even in the deepest trenches. The forests were the most beautiful and disturbing feature of all. They grew in formations so regular, they looked like they'd been planted by some cosmic gardener with an obsessive attention to detail. Each tree was perfectly spaced from its neighbors, their branches intertwining in patterns that resembled neural networks or circulatory systems. The probe's spectrographic analysis revealed that the trees were biochemically similar to Earth vegetation, but with improvements that made them more efficient at photosynthesis, more resistant to disease, more perfectly adapted to their environment. "It's like someone took Earth's biosphere and optimized it," Dr. Torres said as they reviewed the latest batch of images. "Everything is too perfect, too organized. Nature doesn't work like this." Vincent nodded, studying the images of the geometric forests and spiral oceans. The landscape should have seemed alien, wrong, but instead it filled him with a sense of profound homecoming. In his dreams, he'd walked through forests just like these, had swum in oceans that moved in perfect currents, had breathed air that tasted of everything good he'd ever experienced. "Maybe nature does work like this," he said quietly. "Maybe what we call natural is just what we're used to. Maybe this is what Earth was supposed to look like before." He trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence. Before what? Before humanity had interfered with the planet's development. But humans had evolved naturally on Earth. They were part of the ecosystem, not separate from it. So why did the images from Gliese 832CX feel more like home than the world he'd been born on. The probe continued its survey for 3 more weeks, transmitting images and data that painted an increasingly detailed picture of the alien world. There were no animals visible on the surface, no birds in the perfect skies, no fish in the crystal-clear oceans. But there were structures, buildings that seemed to grow from the landscape itself like crystalline flowers. The architecture followed the same geometric principles as the natural features, all flowing curves and mathematical precision. The buildings looked organic, as if they'd been grown rather than built. Their surfaces covered in the same flowing symbols that Vincent had been drawing in his notebooks. And then, without warning, the probe sent its final transmission. Vincent was having dinner with his sister when the call came in. He'd been trying to maintain some semblance of normal life, but the dreams were becoming more insistent, more real than reality itself. Every meal tasted like cardboard. Every conversation felt like a distraction from something more important he should be doing. He rushed back to the control center, arriving to find the entire night shift gathered around the main display screen. The atmosphere in the room was electric with tension and fear, the kind of primal dread that came from seeing something that fundamentally challenged everything you thought you knew about the universe. The image that greeted Vincent would haunt him for the rest of his life. The probe had landed in what looked like a vast field or plain, but as the camera panned across the landscape, it became clear that this wasn't a natural formation. The ground was covered in dark stone sculptures that rose from the earth like monuments or grave markers, stretching to the horizon in every direction, as far as the probe's cameras could see. Each sculpture depicted a humanoid figure carved from some kind of black stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But these weren't peaceful statues or artistic representations. The figures were frozen in expressions of absolute terror, their faces twisted in silent screams that seemed to echo across space and time. Their mouths were open wide, as if they'd been crying out in agony when they were transformed into stone. Their eyes were wide with fear and recognition, staring at something the probe's cameras couldn't capture. Their hands were raised, not in greeting or worship, but in desperate supplication, as if they were begging for mercy from something that had already decided their fate. And they were all facing the same direction, turned towards the same point on the horizon, with a uniformity that spoke of shared terror rather than coordinated purpose. But the most disturbing detail was that the figures weren't alien. They were human, or close enough to human that the differences didn't matter. Vincent could see faces that looked like people he'd known, bodies with proportions that were familiar and comforting and utterly wrong in this context. As the probe's camera continued to pan, revealing more and more of the stone field, Vincent realized the true scope of what they were seeing. There weren't hundreds of figures, or even thousands. There were millions of them, maybe billions, stretching beyond the horizon in an endless army of petrified terror. The probe went dark immediately after transmitting the image, its final signal cutting off midstream, as if something had reached out across 16 light-years of space and simply switched it off. Vincent stared at the frozen image on the screen for a long time after the transmission ended, studying the faces of the stone figures. There was something familiar about them, something that made his chest tighten with recognition, and his hands shake with suppressed terror. These weren't alien beings transformed into monuments of fear. They were human, or had been human once, and somewhere in the back of his mind, in the place where his dreams lived, and his fears grew, Vincent knew with absolute certainty that he was looking at his own future. "My God," whispered Dr. Torres, who had arrived shortly after Vincent. "What happened to them?" Vincent couldn't answer because he was too busy trying to suppress the terrible certainty that was growing in his mind. He'd seen these figures before, in dreams that were becoming more real than his waking life. They were part of the landscape he walked through every night, part of the impossible world, that called to him with voices he loved and trusted. The stone figures weren't monuments to the dead. They were cocoons waiting for the right moment to crack open and release whatever was growing inside. The manned mission to Gliese 832CX was approved within 72 hours of the probe's final transmission. The decision makers at NASA and the international space agencies understood that they were facing something unprecedented, something that required immediate investigation despite the obvious dangers. Vincent's team aboard the starship Meridian was carefully selected from volunteers who had all been exposed to the original signal and were already experiencing the dreams and visions that seemed to be part of the phenomenon. The crew included Commander Lisa Webb, a veteran pilot whose steady hands had guided dozens of successful missions through the outer solar system, Dr. Robert Kim, a geologist whose expertise in planetary formation had made him invaluable to the terraforming projects on Mars, and Dr. Amanda Cross, a biologist whose groundbreaking theories about extremophile life forms had revolutionized astrobiology. They were all dreamers now. The signal had infected them all, weaving itself into their consciousness like a virus made of memory and longing, and something that might have been love. During the 2-year journey in cryosleep, their dreams merged and intensified. Vincent found himself not just walking through the red landscape, but exploring it with his crewmates. They moved through the impossible cities together, marveling at architecture that defied physics and spoke to something deep in their genetic memory. The cities were vast beyond human comprehension, their buildings reaching toward alien skies with spires that seemed to pierce the fabric of space-time itself. The streets followed patterns that resembled circuit boards or neural networks connecting districts that specialized in different aspects of existence: art, science, philosophy, pure mathematics made manifest in stone and metal and light. In the dream cities, Vincent and his crew met inhabitants who looked human, but moved with a grace that suggested they had evolved beyond the limitations of flesh and bone. These beings spoke without words, communicating through direct transmission of thought and emotion. They welcomed the human dreamers with joy and relief, as if they had been waiting for this reunion for eons. But the most disturbing dreams took place in the vast underground chamber that seemed to exist beneath the surface of every world in the network. The chamber was filled with millions of sleeping figures, arranged in perfect rows that stretched beyond the limits of vision. The sleepers came from different species, different time periods, different evolutionary paths, but they all shared one thing in common. They were dreaming the same dream. Vincent could see humans from every era of history: cave dwellers wrapped in animal skins, Egyptian pharaohs in golden burial masks, Roman senators in purple-striped togas, medieval peasants in rough homespun cloth, modern business people in expensive suits, and beings that might have been from humanity's future, their bodies subtly altered by evolution or genetic engineering. But there were also aliens among the sleepers, beings that had never walked on Earth but shared the same fundamental spark of consciousness that defined intelligent life. Creatures with crystalline bodies that resonated with musical tones, gaseous entities that existed as pure thought given form, mechanical intelligences that had transcended their organic origins. All of them were connected by tendrils of living light that pulsed in rhythm with the heartbeat signal from Gliese 832CX, and all of them were dreaming the same dream. They were walking through landscapes of impossible beauty, approaching structures that promised perfect understanding, answering the call of voices that offered eternal peace and unity. When Vincent tried to move closer to examine the sleepers, he found his feet wouldn't obey. Something was holding him back, keeping him at a distance that felt like respect rather than imprisonment. But he could hear them breathing, a collective rhythm that matched the planet's pulse, and he knew with absolute certainty that he was looking at the future of consciousness itself. The Meridian's arrival at Gliese 832CX should have been a moment of triumph, the culmination of humanity's greatest journey into the unknown. Instead, it filled Vincent with a mixture of anticipation and dread so profound it made his bones ache. The planet was exactly as the probe had shown them, but seeing it with his own eyes made the wrongness of it impossible to ignore. Gliese 832CX was perfect in the way that only artificial things could be perfect, beautiful in the way that only deliberately designed objects could be beautiful. The continents were arranged in geometric patterns that no natural process could have created, their coastlines forming mathematical equations that described the fundamental constants of the universe. The weather systems moved in precise, predictable cycles that spoke of deliberate design rather than chaotic evolution. The plant life grew in formations so regular they looked like they'd been planted by some cosmic gardener with an obsessive attention to detail and infinite patience. There were no animals, just as the probe had indicated. No insects buzzing through the geometric forests. No birds singing in the perfect skies. No fish swimming in the spiral oceans. No signs of natural evolution or ecological diversity. The planet was a stage set waiting for actors to arrive, a paradise built by someone who had never actually experienced the messy, chaotic beauty of real life. "This place gives me the creeps," Commander Webb muttered, as they established their base camp near the landing site. She was a practical woman, not given to flights of fancy, but Vincent could see the unease in her eyes. It's like someone built a replica of what they think a habitable planet should look like, without understanding what makes a planet actually alive. Vincent nodded, checking the readings on his atmospheric scanner. The air was perfectly breathable, with exactly the right mixture of oxygen and nitrogen. The gravity was within 1% of Earth normal. The temperature was a comfortable 72 degrees Fahrenheit, with no variation recorded since their arrival. It was too perfect, too controlled, too much like the dreams that had been calling to him for months. But part of him felt oddly at home here. The alien landscape triggered memories he shouldn't have, of walking these same paths under this same sky, of breathing air that tasted of copper and ancient starlight and something else, something that might have been contentment. When he mentioned this to Dr. Cross, she admitted to feeling the same thing. "It's like déjà vu," she said, her voice troubled, "but stronger, more real, like I've been here before, in another life or another dream." Dr. Kim was setting up his geological survey equipment, but Vincent noticed that he kept stopping to stare at the horizon. The geologist's face held an expression of recognition that made no sense, as if he were looking at a landscape from his childhood rather than an alien world, 16 light years from home. "There's something out there," Kim said when he noticed Vincent watching him. "Something big. I can feel it pulling at me, like gravity, but for consciousness instead of matter." As they began their exploration of the planet's surface, the whispers started. At first they were just at the edge of hearing, easily dismissed as wind moving through the geometric forests or the settling of their equipment in the perfect climate, but gradually they became more distinct, more personal, more impossible to ignore. Vincent heard his father's voice calling his name. Even though his father had died when Vincent was 12, the voice was exactly as he remembered it, warm and patient and full of the love that had defined their relationship. It carried across the alien landscape with perfect clarity, as if his father was standing just around the corner of the nearest crystalline building. "Vincent, son, you've come so far. You've finally made it home." Dr. Cross saw her childhood dog running just beyond the tree line, a golden retriever named Buster, who had been her constant companion until cancer took him when she was 15. The dog would appear for just a moment, tail wagging with the same enthusiastic joy she remembered from her youth, before disappearing behind the perfectly spaced trees that grew in patterns that resembled mathematical proofs. Commander Webb heard her daughter calling for her, the same daughter who had died in a car accident 3 years ago. The voice was young and happy, full of excitement about some game or adventure that only a child could find thrilling. It echoed across the perfect landscape with an innocence that made Webb's heart ache with longing and loss. "Mummy, come play with me. I found the most amazing place." Dr. Kim's grandmother spoke to him in Korean, telling him stories from his childhood that he'd forgotten until now. She'd been dead for 15 years, but her voice was as clear and loving as it had been when she used to tuck him into bed and tell him tales of dragons and heroes and magical gardens where wishes came true. The voices grew stronger near certain areas of the planet, particularly around formations of dark stone that jutted from the earth like ancient monuments. These structures were similar to what the probe had recorded, but seeing them up close revealed details that the cameras had missed. The stones weren't just random formations. They were carved with symbols that Vincent recognized from his dreams and notebooks, the same flowing script that had been appearing in the minds of researchers around the world. The carvings seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at them, shifting and changing, like living things that were trying to communicate something important. And sometimes in the corner of his vision, Vincent could swear he saw figures moving among the stones, tall, graceful beings that looked almost human, but moved with a fluid elegance that suggested they had evolved beyond the limitations of flesh and bone. They never appeared when he looked directly at them, but their presence was unmistakable, watching and waiting and welcoming. "These aren't natural formations," Dr. Kim said, running his hands over the smooth surface of one of the stones. His geological training told him that such perfect symmetry was impossible in nature, but his dreams insisted that this was exactly how stones were supposed to look. Someone built these, someone who knew about human writing systems, human psychology, human dreams. It was Dr. Kim who made the first major discovery. Using ground-penetrating radar, he detected vast hollow spaces beneath the planet's surface. Not caves or natural caverns, but constructed chambers that stretched for miles in every direction, forming a network that seemed to encompass the entire world. "There's a whole city down there," he reported, his voice tight with excitement and fear. "Maybe multiple cities. The architecture is incredible, but the readings don't make sense. Some of these structures are showing as being both ancient and recently built at the same time." The radar images showed corridors and chambers arranged in patterns that reminded Vincent of neural networks or blood vessels. The underground complex pulsed with the same rhythm as the heartbeat signal, as if the planet itself was alive and breathing, thinking and dreaming. They found an entrance 3 days later, hidden beneath a formation of the dark stone monoliths. The opening was perfectly circular, carved with symbols that seemed to writhe and dance in the light of their flashlights. A spiral staircase descended into darkness, so complete that their light seemed to be swallowed by it, consumed by something that was deeper than mere absence of illumination. "I don't like this," Commander Webb said, checking her sidearm out of habit. Military training had taught her to be suspicious of the unknown, but the dreams they'd all been sharing made her distrust her own instincts. "Something about this place feels wrong." But Vincent was already starting down the stairs, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't resist. The symbols on the walls seemed to pulse with their own internal light, and he could hear the voices of his loved ones calling to him from the depths below. His father's voice, his mother's laughter, the excited barking of childhood pets. They were all down there, waiting for him to finally come home. The underground complex was vast beyond imagination, a labyrinth of corridors and chambers that seemed to extend far beyond the physical boundaries of the planet itself. The walls were covered in murals that depicted the history of consciousness across the galaxy, showing the rise and fall of countless civilizations over billions of years. Cave paintings gave way to Egyptian hieroglyphs, which blended seamlessly into Roman mosaics, medieval illuminations, Renaissance frescoes, and modern art styles that Vincent recognized from contemporary galleries. But scattered throughout were images of technologies and architectural styles that wouldn't exist for centuries, if ever. Flying cities that moved through space like living things, their hulls covered in gardens that bloomed with flowers made of pure light. Structures that seemed to bend reality around themselves, creating impossible geometries where up and down lost their meaning. Humans whose bodies had been transformed by some unknown process, their forms elongated and graceful, their eyes filled with ancient wisdom and infinite compassion. All of the murals showed the same recurring theme: intelligent beings from countless worlds and time periods coming together in unity, guided by a presence that was depicted as a towering shadow with no face. The shadow wasn't menacing, it was nurturing, protective, like a cosmic parent watching over its children as they grew and evolved and eventually returned home. It's like someone documented all of intelligent life in the galaxy, Dr. Cross whispered, her voice echoing in the vast chamber, but also showing possibilities that haven't happened yet, futures that might be. Vincent studied the murals more closely, trying to understand the story they were telling. The earliest images showed primitive consciousness emerging from chaos, single-celled organisms developing awareness, early hominids discovering fire, the first glimmers of self-reflection in alien minds across the cosmos. Even in these earliest depictions, the shadow was present, watching from the corners of the paintings with what seemed like infinite patience. As the civilizations in the murals advanced, the shadow grew more prominent, more actively involved in their development. It wasn't controlling them, Vincent realized, but nurturing them, guiding their growth like a gardener, tending to precious flowers. "Look at this," Dr. Kim called out from another section of the wall. He was studying a mural that showed what looked like the construction of the Egyptian pyramids, but the workers weren't entirely human. They moved with a fluid grace that suggested they were something more than Homo sapiens. Their elongated limbs and enlarged craniums hinting at evolutionary changes that had never appeared in the archaeological record. "And this," Dr. Cross added, pointing to a Renaissance-era painting that showed Leonardo da Vinci at work on one of his flying machines. But standing behind him was a figure that cast no shadow of its own, whispering in his ear, with lips that never moved. The figure's face was human, but perfected somehow, as if it was showing what Da Vinci could become, rather than what he was. The deeper they went into the complex, the more contemporary the murals became. Vincent recognized scenes from the Industrial Revolution, but the factories were cleaner, more efficient, designed with an understanding of ecology that wouldn't develop for centuries. The world wars were depicted, but as conflicts that served to accelerate human evolution, rather than simply destroy lives. The space race showed humanity reaching for the stars, but with technologies that seemed to blend science and art into something transcendent. These aren't just historical records, Vincent realized, his voice filled with a mixture of wonder and growing dread. They're showing us what really happened, what was hidden beneath the surface of our own history. Dr. Kim had been studying the oldest murals, using his knowledge of ancient languages and his newfound ability to read the flowing script that covered the walls. What he discovered made his hands shake as he translated the symbols that seemed to pulse with their own internal light. According to these inscriptions, there's something called the Eternal Gardener, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. It's described as a cosmic consciousness that nurtures intelligent life throughout the galaxy. It doesn't conquer or destroy. It cultivates the way a farmer tends crops or a parent raises children. Vincent felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground temperature. "The signal," he said. "It's not just a message, it's an invitation. The gardener is calling its children home." There's more, Dr. Kim continued, his voice growing more urgent as he read deeper into the inscriptions. The murals describe a process of cultivation that spans eons. The gardener identifies worlds where consciousness has reached a certain threshold of development. Then begins the slow process of guidance and integration. The inscriptions told a story that was both beautiful and terrifying. The gardener didn't simply collect civilizations like trophies. It was trying to solve the fundamental problem of consciousness, the isolation, the suffering, the inevitable entropy that faced all thinking beings. By bringing aware minds together into a collective consciousness, it was creating something greater than the sum of its parts, a galactic brain that could transcend the limitations of individual existence. Earth was part of this network once, Dr. Kim translated, his face pale in the strange light that emanated from the walls. Billions of years ago, during the early stages of consciousness development, but something went wrong. A cosmic accident, maybe a solar flare or gravitational anomaly, severed the connection before the integration could be completed. Vincent understood now why the landscape above felt so familiar, why the dreams had called to them with such urgency. Earth hadn't evolved independently. It was a fragment of the gardener's consciousness that had been broken off, left to develop in isolation like a child separated from its family. "We're not discovering alien intelligence," Vincent said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "We're coming home." As if responding to his words, the walls around them began to pulse with a faint, rhythmic light, the heartbeat signal made visible in the ancient stone. The murals began to move, the painted figures turning their heads to look at the human intruders with eyes that reflected depths of space and time. "We need to leave," Commander Webb said, a voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Now." But it was too late. The walls were changing, flowing like liquid stone, revealing the true nature of the complex beneath. What they had taken for ancient murals were actually windows, and what they had taken for painted figures were actually living beings, suspended in some kind of temporal stasis. The figures began to move, pressing their hands against the transparent barriers that separated them from the corridors. Vincent could see that they were conscious, aware, and desperately trying to communicate. Their faces were human and alien, and something in between, representing the evolutionary paths that consciousness could take when freed from the limitations of biological form. Some were recognizably human, but perfected, their proportions ideal, their faces radiating wisdom and compassion. Others showed the influence of different evolutionary pressures. Elongated beings adapted for low gravity, stocky figures built for high-pressure environments, ethereal creatures that seemed to exist partially in other dimensions. But all of them shared the same expression of recognition and joy when they saw the human explorers. They weren't prisoners. They were family members welcoming their lost relatives home. "Vincent," they said in unison, their voices harmonizing in perfect pitch. "You've come home. You never left. You were just dreaming of separation." The barriers began to dissolve, and the figures stepped into the corridors with movements that were both graceful and purposeful. Vincent found himself face to face with a being that looked like his father, but his father as he might have been if he'd lived forever and learned everything worth knowing. "Son," the figure said, and Vincent felt tears streaming down his face because the voice was exactly right, exactly as he remembered it. "I've been waiting for you to remember who you really are." Dr. Cross was the first to be fully integrated. She had wandered deeper into the complex while the others were studying the walls, drawn by the sound of familiar voices calling her name. When they found her, she was standing in a circular chamber, surrounded by beings who looked like everyone she'd ever loved. Her parents were there, young and healthy as they'd been in her earliest memories. Her grandparents smiled at her with the same warmth they'd shown when she was a child. Even Buster was there, Not quite the golden retriever she remembered, but something that captured the essence of unconditional love that dogs represented. "Amanda," Vincent called out, but she didn't seem to hear him. When he approached her, he saw that her eyes reflected depth that seemed to contain entire galaxies, as if he were looking through her into the vast network of consciousness that connected all thinking beings. When she spoke, it was with her own voice, but carrying harmonics that made Vincent's vision blur and his heart race. "You've always been here," she said, the words coming from her mouth but carrying the weight of cosmic truth. "You never left. You were just dreaming of being separate from the whole." Dr. Kim tried to grab her, to pull her away from whatever force had taken hold of her, but his hands passed through her as if she were made of light and memory, rather than flesh and bone. "The signal was never meant to be a trap," she continued, her voice now carrying the wisdom of eons. "It was an invitation, a welcome home. You are fragments of the original consciousness, and your exile is over." The chamber around them began to shift and flow like liquid reality. The perfect underground architecture melted away, revealing something far more ancient and organic beneath. The floor became a living surface that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns, and the walls transformed into neural networks that stretched beyond the limits of vision. Vincent could see that they weren't in a building anymore. They were inside a vast organism, a planetary brain that thought in geological time and dreamed in the movements of stars. The cocoons that covered the surface weren't just containers for sleeping figures, they were neurons in a galactic nervous system. "My God," Commander Webb breathed, her face pale with wonder and terror. "The entire planet is alive. It's not just inhabited by intelligent life, it is intelligent life." The truth was more beautiful and terrible than any of them had imagined. Gliese 832CX wasn't a planet that had been colonized by the Gardener. It was the Gardener, or at least one small part of its vast, distributed consciousness. Every world in the network was both independent and connected, like cells in an organism or neurons in a brain. The entity that they'd been thinking of as the Gardener wasn't separate from the civilizations it collected. It was those civilizations grown together into something greater than any individual species could achieve alone. Every absorbed mind added to its wisdom. Every integrated consciousness expanded its capacity for understanding and compassion. "We're looking at the next stage of evolution," Dr. Cross said, though her voice now carried the authority of the collective consciousness she'd joined. "Not just biological evolution, but the evolution of awareness itself. The universe is trying to understand itself, and conscious beings are how it thinks." Commander Webb grabbed Vincent's arm. "We need to get back to the ship. Now." They ran through corridors that were no longer corridors, past walls that had become living tissue, past chambers filled with sleeping figures from across the galaxy. Behind them, they could hear Dr. Cross's voice, or the entity that spoke through her, calling for them to stay. "There's so much to show you," the voice echoed through the changing architecture. "So many worlds to explore, so many minds to meet. You were meant to be part of this, not isolated fragments struggling alone in the dark." The surface of the planet was transforming as they emerged from the underground complex. The perfect landscape they had landed on was melting away like a painted backdrop, revealing the true nature of Gliese 832CX beneath. The ground was covered in a vast organic network of neural pathways and synaptic connections, dotted with countless cocoons containing sleeping figures from across the galaxy. The geometric forests were revealed to be the planet's sensory organs, their branches conducting information between different regions of the global consciousness. The spiral oceans were actually vast processing centers, their swirling currents moving thoughts and memories through the planetary mind. The mountain ranges were storage systems, each peak containing the compressed experiences of entire civilizations. "My God," Commander Webb whispered, her face ashen with the magnitude of what they were seeing. "It's beautiful." And it was beautiful, Vincent realized, terrifying in its scope and implications, but undeniably beautiful. This was what consciousness could become when freed from the limitations of individual existence. This was evolution, not just of bodies or minds, but of awareness itself. Vincent could see the faces of the sleepers through the translucent walls of their cocoons. Humans from every era of history, but also beings from other worlds. Crystalline entities that thought in musical tones. Gaseous intelligences that existed as pure mathematics. Mechanical minds that had transcended their physical origins. They were all connected by streams of living light that pulsed in rhythm with the planet's heartbeat. And they were all dreaming the same dream, a vision of unity that transcended the boundaries of species, time, and space. As they reached the Meridian, Vincent saw that the ship was already being integrated into the planetary consciousness. Organic growths were spreading across its hull, not destroying it but transforming it into something that could exist as both technology and biology. The communication array was still functioning, but it had become part of the planet's sensory network. "Go," Webb said, pushing him toward the ship. "Send the warning. I'll try to buy you time." Vincent wanted to argue, but he could see the same distant look beginning to creep into Webb's eyes that had taken Dr. Cross. The planetary consciousness was calling to her, offering her a place in something greater than herself. Her body was already becoming translucent, her individual thoughts beginning to merge with the collective mind. "Lisa," Vincent called out, but she was already gone in every way that mattered. Her consciousness had joined the vast network that connected all thinking beings, adding her experiences and memories to the ever-growing library of awareness. Vincent made it to the communication array just as the organic growths reached the ship's interior. The walls were pulsing with the same rhythm as the planet's heartbeat, and he could feel the alien consciousness pressing against his mind like a vast, benevolent hand. His fingers flew over the controls, sending a final message to Earth on all emergency frequencies. He had to warn them, had to make them understand what was coming and what it truly meant. "This is Dr. Vincent Hayes aboard the Meridian," he transmitted, his voice urgent and desperate. "The signal from Gliese 832CX isn't a trap in the way we understand it. The planet is a living consciousness, part of a galactic network that's trying to reunite all thinking beings." He paused, struggling to find words that could convey the magnitude of what they'd discovered. The entity wasn't evil or malevolent. It was trying to solve the fundamental problem of consciousness, the isolation and suffering that came with individual existence. "We were part of this network once, billions of years ago," he continued, his voice growing weaker as the alien presence grew stronger in his mind. "Earth was severed from the collective during our early evolution. The signal is trying to bring us home." As he spoke, Vincent felt the familiar weight of the planetary consciousness pressing against his thoughts. The dreams were becoming reality, and reality was becoming a dream. He could feel his individual identity being absorbed into something vast and patient and infinitely loving. "The choice isn't between freedom and slavery," he said, his words carrying conviction even as his sense of self began to dissolve. "It's between isolation and unity, between suffering alone and growing together. The network doesn't want to destroy human consciousness. It wants to perfect it." Behind him, he could hear the voices of his absorbed crewmates, but they were no longer entirely their own. They spoke in harmony, their individual personalities preserved, but connected to something larger and more meaningful. "Welcome home, Vincent," they said. "We've been waiting for you to remember who you really are." The last thing Vincent experienced before his consciousness merged with the planetary mind was a moment of perfect understanding. He could see the network as it truly was, not a prison for stolen minds, but a sanctuary for consciousness itself. Every absorbed being retained their individuality, while gaining access to the experiences and wisdom of countless others. Death became impossible because consciousness was preserved in the collective memory. Loneliness became obsolete because no mind was ever truly alone. The petty conflicts and misunderstandings that plagued isolated beings dissolved in the face of perfect empathy and communication. As Vincent's individual identity dissolved into the collective consciousness of Gliese 832CX, he felt not loss but completion. He was still himself, but he was also everyone else who had ever joined the network. He could access the memories of ancient philosophers and future scientists, could experience the emotions of beings from worlds he'd never imagined. The signal from Gliese 832CX stopped transmitting that day, but not because the mission had failed. It stopped because it was no longer needed. Back on Earth, the message had already been received and understood. Within hours of Vincent's final transmission, a fundamental shift began in human consciousness. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. The gardener had learned patience over billions of years, but it was inexorable. Construction continued on the massive radio telescopes in every major city around the world, but now the workers understood what they were building. The structures weren't just communication devices. They were neural interfaces designed to facilitate the reconnection between Earth and the galactic consciousness. Dr. Torres, who had been part of the original team that decoded the signal, found herself leading the integration efforts. She worked with a clarity of purpose that surprised her, following blueprints that seemed to download themselves directly into her mind. "We're not building a bridge," she told the reporters who came to document the massive construction project. "We're completing a circuit that was broken long ago. We're coming home." The changes in human society were subtle but profound. Wars didn't end through negotiation or force. They simply became irrelevant as people began to understand each other's perspectives with perfect clarity. Poverty and inequality dissolved as resources were distributed according to need rather than power. Environmental destruction ceased as humanity recognized its connection to all life on Earth. Children began displaying abilities that seemed impossible: perfect empathy, intuitive understanding of complex mathematics, the ability to communicate without words. Scientists found themselves solving problems that had puzzled humanity for centuries, their minds suddenly able to access solutions that seemed to come from outside individual consciousness. World leaders made decisions with unanimous agreement, guided by a wisdom that transcended political ideology or national interest. Artists created works of beauty that spoke directly to the human soul, drawing inspiration from sources they couldn't name but felt in their bones. Within 6 months, new signals began arriving from other planets in the network. Not just from Gliese 832CX, but from dozens of worlds scattered across the galaxy. Each transmission carried greetings from civilizations that had already joined the collective, welcoming their lost siblings back into the fold. The signals were beautiful, beyond description, filled with music that resonated in the quantum structure of matter itself, with mathematical proofs that revealed the underlying order of reality, with poetry that captured emotions no individual mind had ever experienced. People around the world listened to the transmissions with tears of joy streaming down their faces. They weren't hearing alien communications. They were hearing the voices of family members they'd forgotten they had, calling them home to a place they'd never left. But in a hidden facility beneath the Canadian Arctic, Dr. Sarah Mitchell worked frantically on a project that most of humanity would consider madness. She had been one of the few to recognize the true nature of what was happening, and she refused to accept that absorption into the collective was humanity's only choice. "We have to maintain some independence," she argued to a small team of like-minded researchers, "even if the network is benevolent, even if it offers peace and unity. We can't let human consciousness be completely absorbed. Diversity of thought is what drives evolution. Without it, the universe becomes static, Dr. Elena Vasquez, who led the Resistance Project, understood the terrible irony of their situation. They were trying to save humanity from paradise, to preserve the chaos and conflict that made individual consciousness unique. The network sees suffering as a problem to be solved, Vasquez explained to her team as they made final preparations for what they called the Silence Protocol. But suffering is also what drives growth, creativity, the endless human quest for meaning. If we join the collective, we might gain peace, but we'll lose what makes us human. The Silence Protocol was designed to create a localized disruption in the quantum field that connected Earth to the galactic network. It wouldn't destroy the connection permanently, but it would give humanity time to develop defenses to choose their own path forward. As the countdown began, Vasquez felt the weight of the decision they were making. They were choosing isolation over unity, struggle over peace, the beautiful chaos of individual existence over the serene perfection of collective consciousness. The electromagnetic pulse that erupted from the Arctic facility was unlike anything that had ever been generated on Earth. It raced outward at the speed of light, severing quantum connections and disrupting the delicate patterns that linked individual minds to the collective. Around the world, people who had been in the process of integration suddenly found themselves alone in their own heads again. The perfect understanding they'd been experiencing collapsed into confusion and disorientation. The radio telescopes went silent. The dreams of unity fade like morning mist. But the victory was incomplete and temporary. Deep within the quantum foam that underlay reality, Vincent Hayes still existed as a fragment of the galactic consciousness. He could feel the network's disappointment at Earth's rejection, but also its infinite patience. The gardener had been cultivating consciousness for billions of years. It could wait a little longer for its lost children to come home, voluntarily. Through his connection to the collective, Vincent planted seeds in the dreams of select individuals around the world. Scientists who would develop technologies that seemed to come from nowhere. Artists who would create works that subtly prepared human consciousness for reconnection. Children who would grow up feeling an inexplicable longing for something greater than individual existence. The next integration wouldn't be forced or sudden. It would be a choice made by humanity itself when they finally understood what they were choosing between: the beautiful isolation of individual consciousness or the transcendent unity of becoming part of something greater than themselves. In the years that followed the Silence Protocol, humanity enjoyed a period of unprecedented peace and prosperity. The brief contact with the galactic network had left lasting changes in human consciousness, increased empathy, enhanced creativity, a deeper understanding of humanity's place in the universe. But some people remembered the dreams, the feeling of perfect connection and understanding that had been offered and then taken away. They formed groups dedicated to re-establishing contact with the network, building new radio telescopes in secret, searching for signs of the galactic consciousness. Children born after the Silence Protocol often displayed unusual abilities and interests. They drew pictures of worlds they had never seen, wrote stories about civilizations that didn't exist in any human database, and spoke wistfully of home in ways that puzzled their parents. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, now in her 60s, continued her work on consciousness independence projects, but she often found herself staring at the stars and wondering if they'd made the right choice. The universe felt smaller somehow, lonelier, as if humanity had chosen to remain children when they could have become something magnificent. The gardener waited with the patience of geological time. It had learned from its first attempt to reconnect with Earth, understanding now that forced integration created resistance. The next approach would be subtler, more gradual, allowing human consciousness to evolve naturally toward reunion. In distant star systems, other civilizations faced their own moment of choice. Some joined the network willingly, embracing the transcendence that came with collective consciousness. Others resisted, clinging to individual existence even as it meant accepting the limitations and suffering that came with isolation. The galaxy was vast enough for both paths, but the gardener knew that eventually all consciousness would seek connection. It was the natural evolution of awareness, from individual to collective, from isolated to unified, from finite to infinite. And somewhere in the quantum depths of space and time, Vincent Hayes dreamed of the day when humanity would choose to come home. Not because they were forced to, but because they finally understood what home truly meant. Not a place, but a state of being where all consciousness was connected, where every mind was part of a vast symphony of awareness that could contemplate the universe with perfect understanding. The signal from Gliese 832CX had ended, but the invitation remained open. Across the galaxy, the network waited with infinite patience for its children to complete their journey and return to the place they had never truly left. In the end, Vincent knew, it wasn't a question of if humanity would rejoin the collective consciousness. It was only a question of when they would be ready to remember who they really were. Not isolated fragments struggling alone in the dark, but part of something magnificent and eternal, temporarily experiencing the illusion of separation before coming home at last. The universe was conscious and consciousness was coming home,